In the far north of Japan, known for its harsh and severe winters, lies the stunning and breathtakingly beautiful Hakkoda mountain range. However, behind this natural beauty lies one of the most horrific and tragic incidents in Japanese history. Which occurred over 120 years ago. In January 1902, during rigorous training exercises for the Japanese army in preparation for any potential war in harsh winter conditions, a ship belonging to the Imperial Japanese Army carrying 210 soldiers was wrecked. Consequently, in an attempt to survive in the Hakkoda Mountains, 199 soldiers froze to death, and only 11 soldiers survived. Of the survivors, 8 suffered from frostbite, which eventually led to amputations. Due to the horrific and tragic nature of the story, it has been the subject of novels, books, documentaries, and even films. This is the story of the Death March, officially known as the Hakkoda Walk Disaster. At the beginning of the 20th century, Japan was undergoing significant political, economic, and military reforms, transforming from a feudal society into an emerging industrial power. The army, in particular, was keen on updating its tactics and equipment to match those of Western powers. At that time, Japan was in a highly sensitive and ongoing conflict with the Russian Empire, with both sides believing that war was inevitable. The Japanese Empire was especially convinced of this scenario and began preparing plans and training for any potential military confrontation, which, if it occurred, would likely be in the harsh winter. The training focused on the northern region of Honshu through Hokkaido, as the Imperial Japanese Army deemed it necessary to secure a secondary supply route in case roads and railways were destroyed by Russian naval bombardment. The proposed supply route was the Hashinohe route, which passes through Mount Hakkoda in inland Japan. Therefore, the plan was to train the infantry to cross Mount Hakkoda. Mount Hakkoda is located in Aomori Prefecture in northern Japan, consisting of a series of volcanic peaks known for their severe winters, characterized by heavy snowfall, strong winds, and deadly cold, making it a challenging environment for any expedition, let alone military training for unarmed soldiers in January 1902. Led by Captain Kanda, the 5th Infantry Regiment, composed of 210 men, embarked on a winter training mission to cross the Hakkoda Mountains and return safely to their base in Aomori. The primary goal of this training was to test the soldiers' endurance and their readiness to fight in harsh winter conditions. This training was part of a broader effort by the Japanese Army to prepare for potential conflicts in northern territories, where harsh winters could pose a significant obstacle. The men were equipped with winter gear, including heavy coats, gloves, and boots, and carried supplies for the journey. The soldiers were confident in their abilities, their equipment, and their training, and the Japanese morale was high. On the first day, at 6 in the morning, with only a map and a compass, the regiment covered a long distance, and there were no signs of the impending disaster. They reached Kotogi, a small pass, where they stopped for an extended period. Upon resuming their march, the weather suddenly changed. Rain and snow began to fall, followed by winds that caused a sharp drop in temperatures. The ski team began to stumble, and the supplies they brought froze, increasing the soldiers' suffering. At this point, the idea of returning to their location was proposed because the situation was not promising. But despite this, Captain Kanda and his men continued to move forward, believing they could overcome the harsh environment with their training and the strong spirit and determination of the Japanese man. However, nature does not recognize human will. They marched to Omata Toge, 2 kilometers from Kotogi, where the snow became much deeper, and the ski team carrying the supplies, fuel, and everything needed for survival fell. At 6 in the evening, the captain decided to abandon the sleds and ordered a group of soldiers to carry the cooking utensils and supplies on their backs. After 8 in the evening, they reached the Hiratasa forest, where they dug a trench in the snow to camp, as the situation had become extremely dangerous. On the second day, the weather turned terrifying. A severe storm swept across the mountains, bringing heavy snowfall, gale-force winds, and freezing temperatures. The 210 soldiers found themselves in an unenviable position. In this weather, which they had never experienced before in their lives and were unprepared for such a severe storm, within a few hours, visibility became non-existent due to the dense snow, making it difficult for the soldiers to see each other even from a very short distance. Communication among them became nearly impossible. Many complained of the cold and fatigue. Around 2 a.m., the army officers decided to return, taking the imminent danger seriously. The soldiers struggled to stay together, as some were blown away and separated from the main group. The snow, which initially was just an obstacle they could control, became the deadly enemy. They had to camp in the open without anything to protect them from the cold and wind, because the soldiers carrying the digging tools had withdrawn and disappeared due to the storm. Captain Kanda tried to maintain order and keep his men moving to warm themselves. The winter clothes, which they initially thought were suitable, became heavy due to freezing and turned into a burden. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and the cold began to penetrate their clothing, causing frostbite. Consequently, the soldiers began to lose consciousness due to hunger and exhaustion, and some froze to death. Their morale began to deteriorate. By the third day, the unit's fate was sealed as temperatures dropped to -41 degrees Celsius, the lowest temperature ever recorded in Japanese meteorological history. It seems that was not enough. Nature had more surprises in store for them. Enormous pressure built up in the sky above the mountain, causing heavy snowfall and deadly storms. The soldiers who remained alive could not find their way. They continued their march, which now meant nothing but survival. The remaining soldiers approached death. Their organization collapsed, and they could only maintain their ranks by following the person in front of them. If one was exhausted or lagged slightly behind, they would immediately fall behind and get lost, and falling meant death. The death march continued in the cold, hunger, and exhaustion. At this stage, most of the unit's soldiers had died. On the fourth day, with the snowstorm continuing, despair took hold of the remaining soldiers, many of whom were young and inexperienced. They were trapped in the snowstorm without shelter and dwindling supplies. The cold was killing them one by one. The men who had been strong and resolute were now weak and delirious. Some succumbed to hypothermia in their sleep, and it is known that the sleep of the cold is the last in your life. The faces of the dead soldiers were frozen, and their bodies were numb, and the hope of rescue diminished with each passing hour. Consequently, the survivors decided to organize their ranks and split into two groups, each taking a separate route with the goal of finding help as quickly as possible. Based on this, Captain Kanda and Captain Kuraishi led one group. However, Captain Kuraishi took a wrong turn and got lost in the frozen wilderness. The second group was progressing relatively accurately, but Captain Kanda collapsed from exhaustion. Realizing his impending death, he left a will for Lieutenant Fusanusuke. He wrote in his will, "Contact the main unit and request a rescue team." Fusanusuke could not fulfill the will, as he lost consciousness while standing and was buried in the snow while descending the mountain. However, he was found by a rescue team and became the first person to be saved, though he later had his hands and legs amputated due to frostbite during the rescue operation. Captain Fusanusuke repeatedly mentioned Captain Kanda's name, prompting the rescue team to search the area. They indeed found Captain Kanda, who was on the verge of death. He was so cold that even though the rescue team tried to give him an injection quickly, his skin was so frozen that the needle broke and he eventually died. Finally, the weather improved, allowing rescue teams to venture into the mountains. What they found was a scene of complete devastation, with bodies scattered on the snow, some partially buried by the storm. The rescuers, along with soldiers and local villagers, worked tirelessly to recover the bodies and search for any survivors. Most of those who remained alive were found on January 31st on the cliff where Captain Kuraishi's group had hidden. Battalion Commander Major Yamaguchi was rescued, but he died in the hospital on February 2nd and was considered the person most responsible for this disaster. On the same day, the remaining survivors were discovered. They had managed to survive by finding abandoned huts scattered on the mountain where they hid and kept warm. However, several survivors suffered serious injuries that required amputations. Some had their hands amputated, some their legs, and others their fingers. During this time, 6 other survivors were found, but they died shortly after receiving treatment. The environment in which the rescue team worked was unimaginably difficult and cold. Half of the rescue team suffered from frostbite. The last survivor, Ahara Gosuboro, had his feet and fingers amputated and lived until 1970, dying at the age of 91. In the group, 199 men out of 210 perished. The survivors, including Captain Kanda, were found in deadly freezing temperatures, suffering from severe frostbite and hypothermia. They were evacuated to medical facilities where they received treatment. However, in such incidents and with such details, it is hard for one to forget this experience. The scale of the Hakkoda Mountain disaster had a significant impact on Japanese society and the state. The Japanese army conducted a full investigation into the disaster, seeking to understand exactly what happened and to ensure that such an incident would not be repeated in the future. The investigation revealed several key factors that contributed to the disaster. First, the regiment underestimated the severity of the weather conditions in the Hakkoda Mountains. Their winter gear, although suitable for moderate conditions, was inadequate for the extreme cold and winds they faced. Additionally, the soldiers were not sufficiently trained and qualified to deal with the reality of navigating a snowstorm in rugged, mountainous terrain. Consequently, the Japanese army implemented significant changes to winter training and preparedness protocols to include more realistic simulations of harsh weather conditions. They also improved their equipment, developing more effective winter clothing and gear to protect soldiers from the cold. In 1971, Nitajiro published the novel Hakkoda-san Death March, which tells the story of this tragedy, changing the characters' names and depicting many difficult situations. In 1977, 6 years after the novel's release, the film Hakkoda-san was released based on this novel. The film became famous for its luxurious cast, including prominent and famous actors in Japan. It was chosen as the 4th best film in Kinema Junpo in 1977, and in the following year, it ranked first in the Japanese cinema box office rankings, breaking all previous box office records. To this day, the tragedy of Mount Hakkoda remains a painful chapter in Japanese history, with memorials erected to honor the soldiers who perished in this training. The Hakkoda Mountains have since become a tourist attraction, drawing thousands of visitors from around the world. These stunning mountain ranges attract 2 types of admirers. The first comes to enjoy nature and skiing, while the second comes for tourism and enjoyment, and to learn about the terrifying and tragic story hidden within these mountains.